The topic for 3.1 CAM is changes in ecosystem, changes, things that are changing, differences. Ecosystems, we said that can be as small as a log or a pond, as big as a mountain range. It's how a group of abiotic and biotic factors all interact. So just by looking at the title, you can make a pretty good indication of what we're going to look at. Ecosystems change over time. I have a short video. Put your pencils down. If ecosystems change over time, what does that mean? Well, we have something called, and you've probably heard this term, natural selection. Hence the Simpsons video that I just showed you. This is the process by which species adapt to environmental changes. So in your DNA, some kind of DNA mutation can create a variation. If the variation is disadvantageous, the odds are that that particular life form or organism will not live long enough to reproduce and pass that mutation on to its offspring. If you have a favorable mutation, favorable mutations are much more likely to survive and reproduce. Natural selection, the process by which species adapt to environmental changes. Competition for food and space is the driving force behind natural selection. The best adapted members of a species are more likely to, what word do you think goes in the blank here? One thing, all life wants to survive. And there's a second thing that life wants to do, reproduce. You've heard this all summarized improperly as survival of the fittest. The problem is the word fit meant something different 150, 200 years ago in England than the way it does now. Because now when we talk about fitness, what you think is survival of those that are best in shape. But what it used to mean is survival of those that can fit into their environmental niche the best. The fittest. They fit the best. Natural selection poster. I think I have one. So we have something called adaptive radiation. What does adaptive mean? The ability to change or adapt. Radiation in this case is not like nuclear radiation, but spreading out, the way sunlight radiates from the sun, the way heat radiates from a fire. So it's the change from an ancestor, hang on, the word ancestor is there already, from a common ancestor to a number of different species. All of us have 4 DNA bases. What are the 4 base pairs that you learned in Science 9? 4 letters. A, G, T, and C. Okay, plants have those same 4, which is why we think maybe all life started from the same cell. If you go far up enough, the evolutionary tree, eventually, if it's living, it's got DNA, it started somewhere, because bugs and slugs and plants and animals all have those 4 base pairs. So the change from a common ancestor to a number of different species, it occurs because of competition for food and space. I said that already. The new species occupy different niches. That's a fancy word for a little area that you just fit in well. You're needed there for other species to thrive and survive as well. You find your niche. Put your pencils down. What else? Well, then we have something called ecological succession. These are the changes that take place in the types of plants and animals in a particular setting over time. This is almost like how a landscape evolves, how a landscape changes over time. There are 2 main types, what we call primary succession, Can you guess what the second type is? Is the first type is secondary succession. So before you turn the page, primary succession would be bare rock, slowly going then into lichen and moss. Let me bring this, lichen and moss. So this would be an example of primary succession because there was no life there before, rock. Secondary succession is going to be a bit different. So now let's turn the page. Primary succession, bare rock. Specifically, it occurs on bare rock where no soil exists. If there's no soil, what else does that mean can't exist? Plants in particular, and we've said plants, it starts with plants and everything. Those are our primary producers, and then we go into the primary consumers and all that. Where is there bare rock with no soil? Well, after a volcanic eruption, or the retreat of glaciers. There is a life form that actually can grow and eat and metabolize and use for nutrients bare rock. They are called lichens. You may have seen them if you're hiking in the woods along a cliff and you've seen not moss growing on the rock, but this very, very thin, whitish, almost crusty, pasty stuff. And they're very important. They're the first to colonize. Their spores are usually carried there by water or wind. And what they can do is they can break down the rock and form a very, very thin soil. There's our first start. Except what's the word for first that begins with the letter P that we're talking about here? Primary. Okay? Well, after that, then the next thing, and you'll see this on rocks all the time, moss can survive. And then when the moss breaks down as well, its nutrients return to the soil. It adds to the soil. And this can take hundreds of years or more. So, primary succession. Once we have some soil, we have what we call pioneer species. What's a pioneer? So can you figure out what word goes in the next blank? First species to live in a particular area. This is why I said, Cam, a lot of this is kind of common sense-ish. It's more learning the terminology. And what they do is they alter the conditions to allow other species to survive in the ecosystem. So these pioneer species are adapted to grow in harsh, nutrient-poor conditions. And the key is they create a word that begins with the letter S and rhymes with oil. Soil. And they add organic matter by dying and decaying. They enrich the soil with their death. Compost. So then they make the soil more fertile. And because the soil has a bit of a covering now, it also helps the soil keep in water. Doesn't evaporate so fast when the sun hits it. These provide food for insects, etc. I wrote see page 112, 113 for a nice timeline. I'll just show it to you. In fact, I think it eventually the area evolves to form a mature, I think the word we're looking for here is community. I was going to say ecosystem, community. The ecosystem slowly changes over time. Each community alters the biotic living, and what's the opposite of biotic living? Abiotic. Abiotic components, so the next community can exist. So after moss comes, then after those die off and enrich the soil, now tyrant ferns, bigger plants. And after those die off and enrich and also break down the rock and break down the soil even further, now you might get smaller plants and then scrub and then bushes and then trees and then the whole schmear. Eventually, a mature community, or there's another fancy word for that, a climax community, develops. The end of the story, so to speak. So, examples of that would be boreal forests, tropical rainforests, grasslands, etc. Mature ecosystems tend to have actually fewer species, as the tree cover is more dense, resulting in less light on the forest floor and therefore fewer species of plants and animals. This is kind of counterintuitive. A lot of people would say, wasn't there more life forms in a forest? Actually, it's, hey, remember the two most important things were temperature, precipitation, temperature, light, sunlight. Less sunlight, you get fewer life forms.
Isn't the entire tropical rainforest covered in like canopies?
It is, and so there's actually different levels depending on how high you move up the trees, how much light reaches them. In fact, there's entire ecosystems up in the trees where sunlight gets to quite readily.
So not on the ground floor, it's not in the
There is, just because there you have the temperature taking dominance in that it's good weather year round. So there's growing season year round, but the soil in the rainforest is very poor. Even though you think, wow, lush jungles, it's very poor soil. It's just that no winter, they're going to grow because they got year round. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
What comes after primary succession? This occurs faster than primary succession. Secondary succession usually occurs after some kind of a disaster. Flooding, or what's the fancy word when it doesn't rain for a long time? California's experiencing drought. Or if you're from Texas, drought. Tsunamis, big time. The one actually that we're dealing with here in BC, the pine beetle insect infestations, has wiped out a significant portion of our interior forests. Oh, you know what? Insect infestations goes there. I'm sorry, guys. Insect infestations goes there. Locusts in Africa and in South, I think mostly in Africa, but somewhat in like grasshoppers in North America used to do damage to farmers' crops as well. We pretty much pesticided them out. What do I want after tsunami? Oh, you know what? So here, cross out forest fires are the other one we deal with here in BC. Forest fires is, oh, forest fires. There you go. Sorry, I looked at the wrong line in my notes. Volcanic eruptions. If you're bored sometime, do a YouTube search for Mount St. Helens and watch some of the documentaries, because there we've had a chance to watch where all these trees got wiped out with mudslides and slag and lava, and already now, not that long later, 30 years later, there's a full ecosystem, a secondary succession that has occurred. The reason it's faster is the soil is already in place, along with bacteria and microorganisms and seed in the soil, so recovery is much faster. Much faster. In fact, instead of hundreds of years or more, it can be decades, like Mount St. Helens, or even years. You can go to a place where a forest fire occurred maybe 3 or 4 years later, and you may only be able to tell that it was there in certain areas, but you already see small trees coming up and small greenery. Natural causes, so one of the big ones in BC, in North America, forest or grassland fires, they seem like disasters, but actually they're part of the natural cycle of growth and decay. And many organisms have adapted. So for the past couple of 100 years, our policy was to prevent forest fires, and we've realized actually that's not the best way. Forest fires naturally help sections of forest, or grass fires naturally help sections of prairie refertilize themselves and replenish themselves. And so in the past 40 years in particular, our policy has sometimes been, well, if there's nobody in the area, we'll let the fire burn itself out as opposed to put it out. So what are some adaptations that organisms have done? Well, grass roots extend over 3 meters into the soil. The grass burns, but a few days later, the roots are popping back up again. What kind of a bark adaptation on trees would help in forest fires? Looking for one word, blank bark on trees. Dry, not so much, because that might... I'm looking for a word that begins with T and rhymes with stick. Thick. Go check out some of those trees that are very old, especially if you do walk through an area where there once was a forest fire. You'll see some of those trees that survived. I mean, that bark is as thick as my forearm. It's thick. There are some trees that need a forest fire because it turns out their pine cones need the heat from a forest fire to explode and spread the seeds. So the seeds often survive. Animals are less successful at surviving forest fires, but certainly some animals can burrow into the ground. It depends on how big the fire is. It depends if if you're surrounded by it or not. So forest fires, again, do a YouTube search. They can do something called crowning, which is when the fire hits a certain temperature, very hot, thankfully. The tops of the trees can spontaneously just ignite because it's hot enough for the leaves to catch fire, and the fire will jump from top of tree to top of tree to top of tree. It's called crowning because it's the crowns of the trees going very, very fast. Not much can outrun that. Even vehicles have a tough time outrunning that. Fires aren't all negative. They do help with recycling nutrients. Remember our nutrient cycles. Yo. I don't have one handy. No one's asked me before, but a note to self, I'll try tracking one. I would go to YouTube and type in forest fire crowning, and I'm sure you'll find some stuff. Flooding. Hey, Pitt Meadows is famous for the different dikes around that prevent flooding. We're by the Fraser River. So, along coastal areas, lakes, and rivers. In our area, it's usually due to rapid what melt? Snow, combined with heavy rains. What town had a massive flood about 2 weeks ago that basically wiped out significant portions of the town? Little interior town that many of you drive through if you go to the interior. Yeah, Cache Creek, okay? It was in the news like crazy. They had crazy amounts of water, a flash flood. So what does flooding result in? Well, it can result in soil erosion because flooding, unlike forest fires, carries good soil off with it. In metropolitan areas, it can result in soil pollution because there's gunk on our sidewalks and pavements, and that gets washed into the drains, and most of those drains just drain into the land, into the rivers. And disease via sewage. Tsunamis. So we've had, in the past 15 years, 2 very large ones. We had the one in 2004 on Boxing Day that killed over 250,000 people in Indonesia, in that area there in Asia. And then we had a tsunami after the Japan earthquake in I think that was 3 years ago. So those have been the two big ones. We had one on our west coast in Alaska in, I'm going to say, 1964 that actually did major damage up and down the coast as well. So huge, rapidly moving ocean waves. What causes tsunamis? That's one. Courtney, you're right. Second one was what? Volcanoes. Destroys organisms in its path. The reasons saltwater ocean tsunamis do so much damage is if the water comes inland several miles, it leaves a lot of salt behind. Hey, from what you've heard, is salt good for growing stuff? No. So it can increase soil salinity. That's the fancy word for saltiness. And it can just do massive destruction. Drought. We may be dealing with this summer. How much snow did we get this winter here in the lower mainland Fraser Valley? How much snow did our ski hills get this winter here in the Fraser Valley lower mainland? Very little. Where does that melted snow go to? Our water reservoirs. How are our water reservoirs doing? Not good. Now, if we get some rain in the summer, we're okay. And we usually do, but if we get a dry summer, we may be dealing with this. You've seen California is dealing with this on a massive level right now. Yeah.
Yeah, but like in BC, we have like a plethora of fresh water.
A plethora, nice try, but good. Yeah, but not here in the lower mainland easily accessible. It's expensive to pump the stuff from Lake Wissapakaki somewhere up in the interior. It may be there, but getting it from there to here on an industrial scale ain't going to happen that easy.
Yeah, we send all our water to California.
We don't send that much. A lot of it is the Columbia River, actually, which we do share, I think, in southeastern BC. I think some of the Columbia, and I don't know, my geography is weak. I believe some of the Columbia is some of the Okanagan Valley uses some of the water there, and it also flows into Washington State, Montana, and some of that. The big one, the U.S., they've been using the Colorado River, which carved the Grand Canyon, and they've been using that like crazy. So you can see videos where there used to be boats, and they're sitting in the middle of a desert, because over the past 40 years, the lake that used to be there that everyone used to fish in now is 10 miles of open desert because they've drained the river so much that the lake doesn't form anymore. So, pardon me? I think salt flats are, and again, I'm not a geologist, I think they're the remnants of oceans that have evaporated. Usually those are natural evaporations, but not always. Sometimes it's, again, us mucking around with things. Below average amount of precipitation. Crop failure, death of animals. The frequency of drought seems to be, what do you think? Increasing. We believe, and I don't want to be, a big environmentalist, although I am pro-environmental. It's a politically charged topic, but it seems to be increasing. It does seem that climate change is occurring. The one that I remember over the past 10 years, so I grew up, my folks had a cabin by 100 Mile House. I think I mentioned this to you folks, and I went there every summer for 2 or 3 weeks. It was great. It was lakefront property. We sold the cabin when I was around 22 or 23, and I don't want to go back because I've heard the pine beetle has come through there, and all the trees that I remember, all the forests that I remember are red and dead. It's all red pine needles, and the trees are all dead. So the mountain pine beetle destroys only, what word did I want to put here, Mr. Dueck? Older, weaker pine trees. Turns out the younger trees can actually defend themselves. They produce, the fancy word is a resin that makes it tougher for pine beetles to attack them. But the Asian pine beetle, which was not native to North America, they didn't have much of a defense for. And what we needed to kill it off was a nice cold snap of about 3 weeks, where here it'd be about -5, and in the interior it'd be about -35. And for about 10 straight years, we never got one of those, which I also think is due to the planet warming up. Yep.
Is it the resin like sap?
Yep, that's the fancy word for sap. So the beetles are a natural part of an ecosystem. Again, it allows nutrient cycling and create space for new trees, but lately too many beetles. And they're hungry. So they're attacking younger trees too, killing entire forests. And this was an inadvertent consequence, Courtney, of our putting out forest fires all the time. It was well-meaning because we thought we were preserving the forests. We thought we were. So forest fire prevention results in older trees. Now, older trees are the prey. The beetles are the predator. So if the prey goes up, what happens to the predator? Goes up or goes down? So, more beetles. Jaden, you going to make it? Cold winters kill beetles, but not cold enough lately. And for a young tree, if too many beetles attack or the tree is stressed, it can't produce enough resin, and so its natural defense doesn't work. So now the beetles were killing and are killing young trees that normally could fight them off. Duncan, can you read me the title for section 3.2? What do you think? Do we do a good job or a bad job? Pretty bad job. Okay. Pretty bad job. So, the ability of an ecosystem to sustain ecological processes for the future, we call this sustainability. Again, a word that you probably know the meaning of. And ideally, Tyra, when we interact with an ecosystem, we'd like to do it in a sustainable way. Ideally. Hopefully. Sure would be nice. Not often. So, sustainability is the ability of an ecosystem to sustain itself for the future while also still providing economic opportunities for humans. Hey, we have to eat. We have to make a living. I get that. And if it sounds like I've been slagging humanity the past couple of days, that's not really what I mean to do. I understand that. People need paper, and trees need to be cut down to make paper. People need farms, and land needs to be cleared in order to plant crops, and fertilizer needs to be used in order to get those crops to grow, and pesticides need to be sprayed so that those crops don't get eaten. I get that. But we want to find better ways. For example, wetland bogs, especially here in Pitt Meadows, are used for blueberry and cranberry farming. You've probably seen in the fall when they flood the cranberry fields and the berries literally float up and they scoop them up, right? So what are some of the effects of land and resource use? Historically, when we were non-industrialized, we were okay at it. Not perfect, but okay. So throughout history, people have used the land and its resources to meet their needs. Historically, human expansion into ecosystems can destroy or fragment, break apart ecosystems. We can destroy them entirely or we can break them apart. So there's a term called habitat loss. Habitat loss is the destruction of habitats, and that's a tough one for us to find a solution to. What do you guys think? Is human population going up or going down? Is the need for places to live for humans going up or going down? Going up. Now, actually, some of the models show that we'll probably peak right around 2 billion because now more and more families are choosing to only have 1 or 2 or 3 kids as opposed to 8 or 9 kids. If you were a farmer 150 years ago, you wanted a large family because they could work the fields for you. We don't need that so much. But We need room, so we're destroying habitats. Then there's something called habitat fragmentation, and that's dividing it into parts that are no longer connected. Where does that occur? Hey, if you ever drive Highway 1 to the interior, you'll see fences on either side, but deer still want to cross the freeway and occasionally get hit by cars. We fragmented, we cut their habitat in half with a road. Again, well-meaning. I understand why we had to build it, but okay. Wetlands. Wetlands are ecosystems where the soil is waterlogged for all or part of the year. We nickname them the kidneys of the earth, the same way your kidneys are what filter out all of the gunk that you drink or eat. Wetlands seem to filter out all of the gunk that we put into the earth. Wetlands are very important. You wouldn't want to drink water in the wetlands, but generally a few kilometers past the wetlands, if the water is flowing, you'll see it's flowing pretty clear. They're good filters. They also help prevent flooding because they're good sponges. They can absorb lots of water. And they absorb carbon dioxide because there's plants there. And they store it as dead matter. But they're being drained and transformed into parking lots and malls and stuff. Put your pencils down and look up. Keep going. Deforestation. What do you think deforestation means? Okay, clear cutting, which we don't do as much as we used to, but certainly BC for the longest time, we produced a lot of the world's lumber. We had lots of trees. And on one hand, Taylor, if done right, trees are renewable. They grow back. Oh, but only if you don't cut them faster than they'll grow. Okay? So deforestation, forests are logged or cleared and never replanted. That's the big one. Most of the time now, it's mandatory that if you cut logs, you also have to replant trees and then leave it alone for a few hundred years. What does deforestation lead to? It leads to what we call soil degradation. Degradation. The soil's not as good. And erosion. If there's no trees, the rainfall can wash the soil away completely further down, and there's no soil left for plants to grow. It can lead to habitat loss. And it can lead to, here's our fancy word, biodiversity loss. Fewer species. How many moose have you seen wandering around Pitt Meadows? I guarantee 400 and 500 years ago there would have been lots. There's swampy areas. It's perfect for them. They would have loved it. But yeah. And again, that's not necessarily a negative. I like Pitt Meadows. I like Maple Ridge. I like the scenery. I like houses. I like subdivisions. But we have to be more conscientious of our consequences. Agriculture. Farming, which is very necessary for us to survive. Well, we have something called soil compaction. In a farm, the soil particles are squeezed together, compacted. How? Can be caused by farm vehicles, tractors and trucks, or grazing animals, eating grass, cows, sheep, but sheep aren't as common. The big grazing animal here in the lower mainland and really in North America is almost all cows, right? We want our steak and our hamburgers. So what happens? Well, if the soil gets compacted, this actually also increases soil erosion. Now, we can fight that by doing something called, I got to spell this right, aeration. It's air, yeah. This is making small holes in the soil. If you've ever seen sometimes down in the lower fields, you may have seen those little tiny plugs of grass and soil sitting on top. They've come with a machine and they've aerated those fields, putting holes in there deliberately that actually reduces runoff because it improves the movement of air and water through that soil. Those lower fields are compacted, not from grazing animals, not from vehicles, but from people playing sports on them, running on them all the time. Okay? Why don't we need to do our upper field here? Artificial turf. Although until we had that built, they always would also be doing it here every couple of months. Nearly done. Resource exploitation. This is the use of resources such as fish or timber or minerals, gold, copper, etc., fossil fuels, etc. What's the problem? Well, number one, contamination. We introduce harmful chemicals, toxins, or waste into the environment. Go look at any strip mine. When the mine moves out, the soil is almost always still pretty toxic because they use chemicals to separate the gold or the silver or the copper or the iron or whatever from the rock itself. They use some pretty intense chemicals, and they're not perfect. Hey, was there a big mine spill? I think it was the Mount Taylor spill last year or something like that, right? You heard about it in the news? What else? Overexploitation. Too heavy use of a resource can result in extinction. When I was in grade 3, I wrote a paper. We were asked to pick the major industries of BC, and so I picked what at that time was the second biggest industry in BC. It was salmon fishing. I doubt salmon fishing is even top 10 anymore. Oops, we fished too many. Okay. Some examples. This is one that's staggering. This is one that humans did. The passenger pigeon. We think around 1880, there was around 5 billion passenger pigeons. There are stories, there are logs, there are journals of flocks of pigeons taking 3 and 4 days to fly over a town. They were that big. And we wiped them out in about 30 years. And this was before we had machine guns. This was just with hunters shooting them with standard rifles. One that can't, buffalo is another one. There used to be a lot of buffalo. We wiped those out. Now they're only existing in small enclosed herds. The one that we did on the East Coast, Atlantic cod, overfishing. Otter, oh yeah, especially the fur trade, we did a lot of damage to different species. By the way, if you start reading some of the history of species extinction, some of it is just depressing. You'll find time and time again, because in the 1890s, in the 1900s, in the 1910s, in the 1920s, it was considered sportsmanlike, it was considered manly to shoot and kill the animal. And so you will see time and time again biologists finding the last 2, for example, passenger pigeons, and proudly shooting them dead so they could stuff them, because I got them. I got the last 2. I wiped them out. Thankfully, our attitudes have changed. But it's kind of depressing when there's numerous instances of people knowing it was the last 2 and killing them. Yeah. They're looking at the feasibility of. In fact, I think I'm going to be talking about that. I think in the next lesson, reviving dead species. So, what are some of the impacts on the food web? Well, overexploitation affects interactions in food webs. So, for example, we overhunted whales in the 1880s, really when we industrialized it in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. And so killing all these whales, what happened then, we had removed a species from their niche. And so that caused the orcas that fed on sperm and baleen whales, because orcas are not whales, they're dolphins, and they eat other whales. Well, they still got to eat. So they found new prey, seals, sea otters, salmon, which we wanted to eat. Low numbers of sea otters resulted in a huge increase in sea urchins. And sea urchins eat kelp forests, sometimes destroying them completely. So we have somehow, by us killing whales, we killed off kelp, because everything is interconnected. Kelp loss can be as high as 45% in one day. Put your pencils down. We, historically, our culture has tended to look down at, or look with arrogance down at, past practices. We have assumed, in fact, we even use the word, we call them primitive peoples, people 1,000 years ago. We're learning, although maybe they didn't have an iPhone, maybe they didn't understand electricity, often through trial and error, they had a better understanding of the ecosystem and how to work with it than we did. So, resource management and traditional ecological knowledge, we get valuable data about local climate and resources, plant and animal life cycles, and this information we have learned was passed down from generation to generation, not through printing, but orally through word of mouth in the various First Nations peoples that lived. For example, the Cree burning grasslands in northern Alberta was an early form of eco-management. They recognized that fires in grassy areas were healthy. You just had to do it safely and correctly. And so we've started to realize that we need to do more research over past practices. And was that a phone that went off there or something? No? Oh, it was outside. Okay. So as an example, and I mentioned this earlier, we've slowly shifted our forest philosophy from preventing all forest fires to creating controlled burns. Now, we won't do this, for example, a half a kilometer from Whistler Resort, but in areas where there aren't significant population outposts, let it burn in a controlled manner. That's actually healthy. And that's something that really has only changed in the past 20 years or so. I was always taught only you can prevent forest fires. I saw all the Smokey the Bear videos. Turns out, maybe we were wrong on that. What's your homework? I have 2 sheets for you. And I think you